The kid at the centre of the room leaned back on his stool and raised his coffee mug like it was a trophy. I'm telling you fellas, that callsign is buried so deep in the archives that half the current guys in the unit don't even know it existed. St. Michael 9. You will not find that in any open source database, on any veteran forum, on any podcast, anywhere on the internet. No civilian on this planet has ever heard those 3 words in the correct sequence, let alone knows what the authentication response is. That's how deep that thing is buried. I'd put money on it. The 3 other operators around his table laughed and raised their own mugs in a half-mocking toast, and the rest of the lounge, about 9 or 10 men scattered around the room nursing coffees and catching up on a slow Friday afternoon, smiled politely the way you smile when a kid is telling a story that is mostly for his own benefit. And from the far corner of the lounge, in a cracked leather armchair nobody had been paying any attention to, a thin old man in a faded field jacket took a slow sip from his own black coffee, set the mug carefully down on the little side table beside him, did not look up, and said, in a perfectly level conversational voice just loud enough to carry across the room, "St. Michael stands the watch." The sound of every single conversation in that lounge stopped at the same time, like somebody had pulled a plug out of the wall. The kid on the stool froze with his mug halfway back to his lips. 3 heads at the next table turned at exactly the same speed. And the owner of the facility, a grey-haired retired Special Forces Master Sergeant named Porter Vance, who had been standing behind the coffee bar wiping down a carafe, went very still, and then very slowly set the carafe down, and then very slowly took off the towel from his shoulder, and walked around the end of the bar with an expression on his face that nobody in that lounge had ever seen him wear before. If you believe the quietest man in a room is almost always the one carrying the most weight, do me a favour right now and type the word copy down in the comments. Because the next 4 minutes are going to teach every young man in that lounge something they thought they already knew about the word classified. His name was Clement Doheny, and people who had known him for a long time had called him Clem since he was about 7 years old. He was 77 years old on that Friday afternoon, a little under 6 feet tall, built the way lean men are built when they have spent their whole lives walking more than they drove, with white hair cut short and kept neat and a thin, pale, inch-long scar along the left side of his jaw that looked like a razor nick from a distance, and that up close looked like exactly what it was, which was the mark of a fragment of a shell casing that had come in sideways off a piece of corrugated metal in a valley in a country that did not officially exist on the maps of the war he had officially not been fighting in. Clem lived alone in a small white clapboard house about 40 minutes outside of Fayetteville, on a quiet road with a mailbox that said Doheny in faded black paint, and he drove a 1987 Ford Bronco that he had bought new in the year his wife Margaret had been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, and that he had kept running ever since out of the same stubborn loyalty he brought to every other relationship in his life. Margaret had passed in 2016, after 31 years of a slow and dignified decline that had required Clem to learn, in his late 50s and his early 60s and his late 60s, how to be a full-time nurse and cook and housekeeper and gentle caretaker in addition to being a husband. And he had learned all of those things the way he had learned everything else in his life, which was quietly and without complaint. The Bronco still had Margaret's old reading glasses in the centre console because he had not been able to bring himself to take them out. In the front right pocket of his field jacket, where other old men might have kept a pocket knife or a set of keys, Clem carried a small round brass challenge coin that was almost completely smooth on both faces now, from 50 years of being thumbed absently in his pocket during long, silent moments. The coin had once had a unit insignia on it. The insignia had worn off about 20 years ago. Clem did not need to see it anymore. The coin had been pressed from a die that had been destroyed in 1974, and there were exactly 12 of them in the world, and 9 of the 12 men they had been issued to were dead now. The Anvil was a private facility tucked into a business park on the outskirts of Fayetteville, North Carolina, about a 20-minute drive from the main gates of Fort Liberty, which most of the men who came to the Anvil still called Bragg out of long habit. From the outside it did not look like much. It was a low, windowless brick and cinder block building with a small sign by the door that said only Anvil Training Group, and the kind of gravel parking lot that was always half full of late-model pickups with subdued unit decals on the back glass. The inside of the building was split into 3 sections. The front was a small reception area with a retired rangemaster named Donna, who had been running the front desk for 8 years and who did not take any nonsense from any man who walked through the door regardless of his unit patch. The back 2/3 of the building was a state-of-the-art indoor shoot house and a 200-yard zero range that Porter Vance had built himself. And in the middle of the building, between the front desk and the shoot house, was the lounge. The lounge was not advertised. It did not have a name on any sign. It was a private room with a small coffee bar, a dozen or so mismatched leather armchairs and stools, a handful of low tables, and walls that were covered in framed photographs and unit plaques going back about 40 years. The Anvil's lounge was where the clientele hung out between training blocks, or stopped in on slow Fridays just to drink free coffee and talk to other men who understood the things they did not have to explain out loud. The clientele was a specific list. Porter Vance did not advertise that list, and he did not publish it. But you did not get into the Anvil's lounge without either being actively assigned to a specific shortlist of units, or having retired out of one of them. There were exceptions. Porter was the one who made the exceptions, and one of those exceptions, for almost 11 years now, had been an old man named Clement Dehaney, whom Porter called Mr. Dehaney in public and called Clem in private, and whom Porter would have given the shirt off his own back to at any moment of the day or night, for reasons that Porter had never fully explained to any of his other members. What none of the young guys in the lounge that Friday afternoon understood, as they leaned on their stools and laughed at Brett Macklin's story, was that the quiet old man in the corner armchair had been sitting in that exact chair once a week for almost a decade, and had never once in all that time said a word about himself. Brett Macklin was 29 years old, and he was a good operator. Everybody in the lounge who knew him would have told you that, and Porter Vance would have told you that first. Brett was Special Forces, 8 years in, currently assigned to a team at Bragg that had recently rotated back from a short deployment, and he was the kind of young soldier who had the physical talent and the technical skill to go a long way in the community if he could just get his mouth under control. The mouth was the problem. Brett's mouth was fast and funny and usually about 2 sentences ahead of his better judgment, and the combination of a long week of stand-down, a free cup of Porter's strong coffee, and an audience of 3 teammates who already thought he was the coolest person in the room had put Brett Macklin into a particular kind of storytelling mood on that Friday afternoon. He had been telling war stories for about 20 minutes. The stories were mostly true. They were also mostly unnecessary, in the way that the loudest stories in a lounge full of quieter men are always unnecessary. And Porter Vance had been letting it slide because Porter liked the kid, and because he knew, the way older men know these things, that young men have to tell their own stories out loud a certain number of times before they stop needing to. But then Brett had started edging up to the line. He had started dropping small hints, small references, small winks at things his teammates were supposed to know about, and the rest of the lounge was not. He had referenced an operation by its unclassified nickname, and then given a knowing little shrug, the kind that implied the classified nickname was better. He had name-dropped a facility in Jordan that was not technically secret, but was not publicly discussed either. And then, because he had been drinking coffee for 90 minutes and had worked himself into the kind of storytelling rhythm where the next line always has to be bigger than the last line, Brett had leaned back on his stool and raised his mug and started talking about St. Michael 9. The part of the story Brett Macklin was telling, the part he was leaning forward to tell, was about how his team had stumbled across a reference to the Callsign in an old after-action review that had been partially declassified about 3 years ago, and then mysteriously reclassified 6 months later after somebody at the Pentagon had apparently realised what had been in it. Brett had read the 8AR before it was pulled. He had asked one of his senior NCOs about it. The senior NCO had looked at him for a long second and then said, very quietly, "Macklin, I am going to say this exactly once, and I want you to take it seriously. That Callsign is not for you. It is not for me. It is not for anyone on this team. If you ever see those 3 words again, in any document, in any conversation, in any context, you pretend you did not see them. Do you understand me?" Brett had understood. Brett had also, because he was 29 years old, and because the human mouth is a weak vessel, completely failed to keep that instruction to himself. He had mentioned it to his teammates. They had gotten curious. They had done their own poking around. And now, on a slow Friday afternoon at the Anvil, Brett Macklin was leaning back on his stool telling the 3 other guys at his table that he had personally never been able to find anything about that Callsign anywhere on the open internet, and that whatever unit it had belonged to had apparently been so deep in the shadows that the authentication protocols for it had been written before The guys currently wearing the unit's uniforms had been born. "I'll put it this way," Brett was saying. "You know how classified has levels, right? There's classified, and there's secret, and there's top secret, and then there's the stuff above top secret that doesn't technically have a name, because naming it would compromise it. St. Michael 9 is 3 levels above the stuff that doesn't have a name. That's how deep that is. That's why I'm telling you, fellas. No civilian on this planet has ever heard those 3 words in the correct sequence, let alone knows what the authentication response is. You could ask every librarian in the Library of Congress and they wouldn't even know where to start looking." And then Brett laughed at his own joke, and his teammates laughed along with him, and that was when Clem Doheny took the slow sip of his coffee in the corner armchair, set his mug down on the little side table and spoke. There is a very particular quality to the silence that falls in a room when a sentence that should not have been possible has just been spoken out loud, and Porter Vance had heard that kind of silence exactly twice before in his life. Once in a command tent in Afghanistan in 2011, when a runner had come in with news that had changed the nature of an ongoing operation, and once in a hospital hallway in Germany in 2003, when a nurse had come out of a room and begun speaking in a voice that was too calm. This silence in his lounge was the 3rd time. It dropped across the room like a blanket thrown over a lamp. Brett Macklin, still holding his coffee mug halfway between the table and his mouth, turned his head very slowly toward the corner armchair. The 3 teammates at his table turned with him, as a single organism. The other men in the lounge, the 2 older retired rangers at the back table, and the 3 contractors playing a hand of cards in the far corner, and the pair of younger Navy guys on the couch by the coffee bar, all of them had stopped moving at the exact same instant, and all of them were now looking at the thin old man in the faded field jacket in the corner chair. Clem was not looking back at any of them. He was looking at his coffee mug. He picked it up again and took another sip, an unhurried, careful sip, the kind of sip a man takes when he's giving the room time to catch up to him. Brett Macklin finally lowered his own mug. His voice, when it came, had completely lost the easy swagger of 30 seconds earlier, and what replaced it was the thinner, more uncertain voice of a young man trying to get a footing on a surface he had just discovered was ice. "Sir, excuse me, sir, what did you just say?" Clem did not lift his eyes from his coffee. "You heard me, son." Brett's jaw worked for a second. "Sir, with all respect, sir, I think you misheard what I was saying. I was talking about—" And Clem, still not looking at him, still holding his coffee mug in both hands, cut him off very gently. "Brett, I heard you. I've been listening to you talk for 23 minutes. You have a nice speaking voice. You're telling your friends about St. Michael 9. You're telling them the call sign is so classified that no civilian could possibly know the authentication response. And I am telling you, without any disrespect intended toward you, young man, that St. Michael stands the watch. Those are the words. That is the response. And I will save you the trouble of asking your next question. The counter to that response, which you may or may not know, is, the watch is never broken. That is the 2nd layer confirmation. The 3rd layer, if you were working an extraction, which you probably were not because you're a kid, and they wouldn't have sent you on that kind of ride yet, was by whose hand? And the answer was, by the hand that was given. He took another sip of his coffee. "Now, do you want to keep telling your story, son? Or would you like to ask me a question?" Brett Macklin did not answer, because Brett Macklin was no longer sure which of the available responses he was supposed to pick. His 3 teammates were staring at the old man in the corner with their mouths slightly open. One of them, a sergeant named Kellerman, who had been on Brett's team for about 4 years, had gone a kind of grey colour under his tan. At the back table, one of the retired rangers had set down his own coffee and was leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, and an expression on his face that suggested he was piecing together a set of facts he had been carrying around for a long time without ever being able to fit them into the right shape. And Porter Vance, who had been standing very still behind the coffee bar for the last 15 seconds, now came out from behind the bar for the 2nd time in that scene and walked slowly across the lounge floor. He did not walk toward Brett. He walked toward Clem. He stopped about 4 feet in front of the corner armchair, and he did something that Porter Vance had not done in 26 years outside of a military ceremony. He came to attention. His heels clicked together, his shoulders squared, his chin came up, and his right hand rose in a slow, perfect salute, held for the full count, and when he brought it down he did not break his posture, and when he spoke, his voice was pitched exactly the way a senior non-commissioned officer's voice is pitched, when he is addressing a man he considers his superior regardless of what any roster anywhere says. "Mr. Doheny, Clem, I'm sorry. I should have said something the minute Macklin started down this road. I should have cut him off. I did not cut him off because I wanted to see how far he was going to take it, and that was wrong of me, and I apologise. And I apologise on behalf of this young man, who is a good soldier, and who is going to be a better one 10 minutes from now than he was 10 minutes ago." Clem finally looked up. He looked at Porter with a small, weary, slightly amused expression, the expression of an older man who's just watched a younger man do something unnecessary on his behalf, and is deciding whether to scold him for it. "Porter, son, sit down. You don't salute civilians in a lounge, and Brett has not done anything wrong. He's telling his friends about something he read in an AAR. That is a very common thing for a man his age to do on a slow Friday. I am not offended. I'm not even surprised. The only thing I am is slightly disappointed that you never told him who I was." Porter Vance lowered his hand but did not sit down. He turned instead to look at Brett Macklin and at the 3 teammates at Brett's table, and at the rest of the men in the lounge who were now all watching him with varying degrees of confusion and dawning comprehension. "All right," Porter said. "All right. Since Clem is not going to tell this himself, and since I have known this man for 11 years and have been waiting for 11 years for an excuse to tell any of you who he is, I am going to tell you right now, and I am going to do it in the shortest possible form because Clem is going to get embarrassed and stand up and walk out of here if I go on too long. So listen carefully. The gentleman in the corner armchair is Mr. Clement Doheny. Some of you may not know that name. Some of you may know it and not believe it. I'm telling you right now, on my own credibility, that it is the real name, and that he is the real man. Mr. Doheny served for 28 years in the United States Army. Most of those 28 years were spent in a unit whose name I am not going to say out loud in this lounge. But I am going to tell you that the unit in question was officially designated on a piece of paper that was signed in the fall of 1972, and that the authentication protocols for that unit were written over the course of a single long weekend in a conference room in Northern Virginia by a group of 12 men who'd been hand-selected for the task by the original commanding officer. One of those 12 men was Clement Doheny. He was 25 years old at the time. He had already done 2 tours in country with a reconnaissance element that some of you may have heard whispers about and most of you have not. The weekend the protocols were written, he was the junior man in the room, and the way I heard the story, it was Clem who came up with the St. Michael phrasing, because Clem's father had been a paratrooper in the Second World War, and had worn a St. Michael medal on his dog tag chain, and Clem said in that conference room, in front of men significantly senior to him, that if you were going to write an authentication protocol for the kind of work the unit was about to do, you might as well write it in the name of the saint who had been watching over paratroopers since before any of them had been born. The senior man in the room agreed. The callsign was approved and entered into the classified register that afternoon. Brett, listen to me very carefully right now. When you read that callsign in a partially declassified AAR 3 years ago, you were reading a callsign that the man sitting in the corner of this lounge helped invent. You were not uncovering some forgotten trivia from the dark corners of the archive. You were quoting one of the original authors, to his face, at a coffee table, in his own lounge. Brett Macklin did not move. His mouth had gone dry. He was still holding his coffee mug in his right hand, and he was only just now starting to realise that his fingers had gone slightly numb around it, because his body had been quietly dumping adrenaline into his bloodstream for the last 60 seconds without him being consciously aware of it. His teammate Kellerman had set his own mug down with exaggerated care, as if he was afraid of making any more noise in the room than he absolutely had to. The retired ranger at the back table had finally put the pieces together on whatever he had been working out, and was now nodding slowly to himself with the look of a man who has just confirmed a theory he had been carrying privately for years. Porter Vance stopped talking and waited. He waited because he had said what he needed to say, and because the next move in the lounge was not his to make. The next move belonged to Brett. The silence in the lounge was so complete that Clem could hear the small electric hum of the refrigerator behind the coffee bar. He looked at Brett with no expression on his face at all, and he waited, patient the way old men are patient when they are waiting to see whether a young man is going to be the kind of man they can still be proud of. After a long, long moment, Brett Macklin set his coffee mug down on the table in front of him, and he stood up. He did not look at his teammates. He did not look at Porter. He walked the 7 or 8 steps across the lounge floor to the corner armchair, and he stopped about 3 feet in front of it, and he did something his drill sergeant in basic training would have been proud to see, even though nobody had ordered him to do it. He came to parade rest, hands at the small of his back, feet shoulder-width apart, chin up, eyes on the old man in the chair, and he said, in a voice that was almost steady, "Mr. Doheny, sir, my name is Staff Sergeant Brett Macklin. I am currently assigned to a team at Fort Liberty. I was out of line, sir. I was telling a story to my friends to make myself look bigger than I am, and I was using a piece of your history as a prop, and I did not know it was your history, and that does not excuse it. If you will allow me, sir, I would like to apologize to you directly, and I would like to buy you a fresh cup of coffee, and I would like to sit down and shut up and listen to anything you feel like telling me about anything at all, for as long as you are willing to talk to me. Sir, please." Clem Doheny looked up at the young staff sergeant standing at parade rest in front of his armchair, and something very small and very warm happened behind his eyes. He did not smile exactly. It was not quite a smile. It was closer to the expression a man gets on his face when a stranger does something unexpectedly decent in public, and reminds him, just for a second, that the world still contains young men who can be corrected by their own conscience, without having to be corrected by anyone else. Clem set his coffee mug down on the side table and gestured with his left hand, slow and open-palmed, at the empty armchair across from his own. "Son," he said, "you don't need to stand at parade rest in a lounge. Sit down, have your coffee. Porter, do me a favour and bring this young man a fresh cup. Brett, bring your friends over too if they want to come. There's no reason 3 good soldiers should have to sit at a different table from their buddy, just because he embarrassed himself in front of an old man." Brett did not move for a second. He had been ready to be yelled at. He had been ready to be dressed down in front of the entire lounge. What he had not been ready for was to be invited to sit down and have a cup of coffee, and the invitation had landed inside of him somewhere a lecture could not have reached. He nodded once, and he walked stiffly back to his own table to collect his teammates, and they all came over together and sat in a loose semicircle around the corner armchair, and Porter Vance, moving with a kind of quiet care that his regulars had rarely seen from him, came around with the coffee pot and refilled every mug in the semicircle, including Clem's, and then went and got a chair for himself and pulled it up at the edge of the circle, and sat down without saying anything, because Porter was smart enough to know that the next hour of his life was going to be one of the important ones, and he did not want to miss any of it. What Clem Doheny told Brett Macklin and his 3 teammates and Porter Vance and, by the end, most of the rest of the lounge, who had quietly drifted over one by one and settled into chairs on the outer edge of the circle, was not what any of them had expected. He did not tell war stories. He did not describe operations. He did not name names or places or dates. He told them instead about the conference room in Northern Virginia in the fall of 1972, and about the 12 men who had been called into it, and about the specific feeling of being the youngest man at a table where everyone else outranked you and everyone else was better at the job than you were. He told them about how the senior officer in the room, a quiet colonel whose name Clem did not say out loud, had looked at the 12 of them on the first morning and had said, "Gentlemen, what we do in this room this weekend is going to be spoken out loud in the dark by men who may not survive the speaking of it. I want you to write words that will carry those men home. That is the only instruction I'm going to give you. Now get to work." Clem told them about the long arguments over syntax, about the way a good authentication phrase had to be short enough to say under stress but specific enough that it could not be guessed, and about how every one of the 12 men in that room had, at some point during the weekend, set down his pen and walked out into the hallway to be alone for a few minutes, because the weight of writing words that were going to be spoken in the dark by men who might not survive had been heavier than any of them had expected. He told them about his father's St. Michael medal, the one that had been clipped to his father's dog tag chain through 3 jumps into Normandy and 2 more into Holland and 1 into Germany, and about how his father had given him the medal on the day Clem had shipped out for his own first deployment, and about how the medal had gotten lost in a river crossing in 1969, but the prayer his father had said when he handed it over had not gotten lost, and that prayer had been what was running through Clem's head on the morning of the 3rd day in that conference room, when he had cleared his throat and suggested, in front of men twice his age, that the unit authentication be built around the name of the saint who had been watching over paratroopers since before any of them had been born. The room had gone quiet when he suggested it, the way the lounge had gone quiet now, and then the colonel at the head of the table had said in the same quiet voice he used to say everything, "Doheny, write it up, exact phrasing, I want it on my desk before lunch," and Clem had written it up. St. Michael 9. Authentication. St. Michael stands the watch. Counter, the watch is never broken. Final layer, by whose hand? By the hand that was given. The Colonel had read it twice. He had signed off on it on the spot. And for the next 27 years, those words had been spoken in the dark by men Clem had never met, in places Clem would never see. And a number of those men had come home because of those words, and a number of them had not. And Clem had carried the list of both the living and the dead in his pocket in the form of a small round brass coin that he still carried, right now, today, in the front right pocket of the field jacket he was wearing, in that corner armchair in a lounge in Fayetteville in the year of our Lord October. Nobody in the lounge spoke for a long time after Clem finished. The coffee had gone cold in every mug in the semicircle, and nobody reached to refill it. Brett Macklin was sitting very still with his hands folded in his lap, and his eyes fixed on the floor about 2 feet in front of his boots, and the expression on his face was the expression of a young man who was rearranging a lot of furniture inside his own head at a very fast speed. After almost 2 full minutes of silence, Brett looked up. His voice was quiet. "Mr. Doheny, sir, can I ask you one question?" Clem nodded. Brett said, "The 9. The number at the end of the call sign, what did the 9 stand for?" Clem looked at him for a long moment, and then he reached into the front right pocket of his field jacket and pulled out the small, worn, featureless brass coin, and he set it on the little side table next to his coffee mug where everyone in the semicircle could see it. "The 9, he said, was the number of men we had already lost from the original 12 by the end of that weekend in 1972. 3 of the 12 were gone before the protocols were even finished. 2 more went within the first 6 months of the unit being operational. 4 more went in the 70s, and the last of them went in 1984. When I left the unit in 1999, I was the last of the 12 still breathing. I still am." That's what the 9 meant. It was a number we put in to remind the guys who had come after us that the watch had already cost something before they ever stood it. I have been carrying that coin in my pocket every day since the Colonel handed it to me in 1973. It used to have a crest on it. The crest wore off a long time ago. I don't need the crest to remember what it was. He paused. Then he picked the coin up again and slid it carefully back into his pocket. "Now, Staff Sergeant Macklin, I'm going to ask you a question back, and I want you to answer it honestly. Why were you telling your friends that story?" Brett was quiet for a long second. Then he said, "Because I wanted them to think I was more than I am, sir." Clem nodded slowly. "And now," Brett exhaled, "and now I want to be more than I am for real, sir. Not for them, for me." Clem looked at him for a long moment, and then he leaned forward in the armchair and put his old brown hand on the young staff sergeant's knee, and he squeezed it once firmly, and he said, "That is the correct answer, son. That is the answer we were trying to teach men to give when we wrote those words in that conference room. St. Michael watches over men who want to be more than they are for the right reasons. He does not watch over men who want to be more than they are for the wrong ones. You just switched sides of the line. That is not a small thing." Porter Vance quietly stood up from his chair at the edge of the circle and walked back behind the coffee bar, not because he needed to do anything there, but because he needed about 30 seconds to himself before anyone in that lounge saw his face, and the coffee bar was the closest piece of furniture he could get behind without making it obvious. When he came back out a minute later, his eyes were red, and he was pretending he had rubbed something out of them, and nobody in the semicircle gave him any trouble about it. One by one, the other men in the lounge came forward to shake Clem Doheny's hand. The 2 retired rangers from the back table, the 3 contractors who had been playing cards in the corner and had not quite understood what was happening at first, but had understood enough by the end, the 2 younger Navy guys from the couch, who had figured out from the context what unit was being talked about and who approached the corner armchair the way men approach an altar. Each of them shook Clem's hand once, briefly, and said nothing or almost nothing, because there was nothing to say that was not already in the handshake. Clem accepted each handshake with the same slight nod and the same small, tired smile, and when the last of them had gone back to his own chair, Clem looked across the semicircle at Porter Vance and said, very softly, "Porter, I think I am going to head home now. Margaret always used to say I got tired earlier than I thought I did on Fridays, and she was always right about things like that." Porter nodded and stood up immediately. "I'll walk you to your truck, Clem." Brett Macklin stood up too. "Sir," with respect, "would it be all right if I walked you out? I'd like to just carry your coffee mug to the sink for you. That's all. Just that." Clem looked at him, and then at Porter, and then back at him, and he smiled the small, tired smile again, and he said, "All right, son, you can carry my mug, but you're not going to carry me. I can still walk to my own truck." And Brett Macklin, 29 years old, Staff Sergeant, United States Army Special Forces, picked up the old man's coffee mug off the little side table with both hands, as carefully as if it was made of glass, and carried it across the lounge to the sink behind the coffee bar, and rinsed it out and set it upside down on the drying rack. And then he walked back and stood next to Porter Vance, and together the two of them walked Clem Dehaney out of the lounge, past the front desk where Donna looked up from her computer, and gave Clem a small nod he returned, and out the front door of the Anvil and across the gravel lot to the old 1987 Ford Bronco with the faded paint and the Doheny mailbox painted on the driver's door panel, the way he had always painted it. Clem drove home through the long slant of October afternoon light the way he always drove home on Fridays, slow and unhurried, with the radio off and the window cracked and the cool Carolina air coming through the cab smelling like pine needles and cold creek water. He didn't think very hard about anything on the drive. He thought a little bit about Margaret. He thought a little bit about the colonel who had signed off on the protocols in 1972 and who had been dead for almost 20 years now. He thought about Brett Macklin's face when Brett had finally understood who he was talking to, and he thought about how there was a specific kind of lesson that a young man could only learn when an older man gave him grace he did not deserve, and about how giving that kind of grace to young men was maybe the last useful thing a man Clem's age could do in the world. When he pulled into his own driveway, the evening light was the colour of weak tea, and the white clapboard of the house was glowing a little in the slant of it, and the cat that had started hanging around the back porch a few months ago was already waiting for him on the top step. Clem got out of the Bronco slowly, the way he always got out of the Bronco now, and he walked up the porch steps and past the waiting cat and into the kitchen. He took off his field jacket and hung it on the hook by the door. Before he hung it up, he reached into the front right pocket and took out the small worn brass coin and set it carefully on the kitchen windowsill, where the last of the evening light was coming in, and he looked at it for a long moment. He did not say anything out loud, he did not need to. Then he filled the kettle and put it on the stove for tea, the way Margaret used to do at this time of day, and he stood at the window watching the light go down over the pines, and he thought, for the first time in a long time, that the quiet in the house did not feel like absence anymore. It felt like a watch still being kept, by hands that had been given it a long time ago and that had never set it down. There is a specific kind of lesson in a story like this one, and it is not the lesson about the classified call sign, and it is not the lesson about the cocky young operator being humbled in front of his teammates, although both of those lessons are real, and both of them are worth keeping. The lesson that matters the most is the one Brett Macklin carried out of the Anvil that afternoon, and has been carrying ever since. Because Brett Macklin did not forget that hour in the corner armchair, and he did not tell the story to anyone outside the lounge, not because Porter asked him not to, but because Brett understood, all on his own, that the story was not his to tell. What Brett did instead, in the months and years after that afternoon, was get quieter. He stopped leading with his mouth. He started listening in rooms he used to dominate. He stopped name-dropping operations and started asking older soldiers about their fathers. And the next time a young private on his team started telling a story that was bigger than the private's actual life, Brett did not shut him down, and he did not embarrass him. He just waited until the story was over, and then he put his hand on the young man's shoulder, and he said quietly, "Kid, come sit with me for a minute. I want to tell you about a lounge in Fayetteville I used to go to, and about an old man who was nicer to me one Friday afternoon than I deserved. I think you need to hear it." That is what Brett Macklin took home from that afternoon. It is what Porter Vance hoped he would take home. It is what Clem Dehaney knew he would take home from the moment Brett had stood up out of his own chair and walked across the lounge floor and come to parade rest in front of an old man in a faded field jacket. Clem Dehaney still lives in that small white clapboard house outside of Fayetteville. He is older now, a little slower, but his eyes are still clear and his hands are still steady. And on Fridays, when the weather is good, he still drives the old Bronco into town and sits in the corner armchair at the Anvil, and drinks Porter's coffee and watches younger men come and go through the lounge, and every so often one of them comes over to shake his hand, and every so often one of them does not. And Clem is fine with either outcome, because Clem has never needed to be recognised in order to be at peace with who he is. The small round brass coin still sits on the kitchen windowsill in the evening light. There are still exactly 12 of them in the world, and 11 of the 12 men they were issued to are gone now, and Clem Dehaney is still standing the watch because he is the last one left who can, and he will stand it for as long as he draws breath, and after that somebody else will stand it, because that is how watchers work. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of the quiet old men in your own life who never brag about what they did and never will, do me one small thing right now. Hit that subscribe button so stories about men like Clem Doheny keep finding you when you need them. And in the comments below, leave 2 words. Just 2. Leave the words, The Watch. Leave them for Clem. Leave them for the 11 men who came before him and the one who is still holding the line. They are still out there, somewhere, in corner armchairs and quiet lounges and small white clapboard houses on back roads, and the watch has never once been broken.